The silver-backed mirror struck the floor, spiderwebbing into 1,000 jagged shards that reflected my sister's twisted, beautiful face. "You are my creation, Alistair," Honoria hissed, her voice a whip-crack in the silent dressing room of Blackfriars Manor. I stood perfectly still as she paced, the silk of her skirts mourning the quiet air. "I spent 10 years molding you into the perfect earl so that you could marry into the bloodline of the crown. And yet, you dare to look with longing at that scullery rat from the orphan's ward." She didn't wait for my defense. She snatched the small, pressed wildflower I had been hiding in my waistcoat and threw it into the roaring hearth. I watched the only piece of beauty I owned turn to ash in seconds, the orange flames licking the petals into black dust. The pain was sharp, but I did not blink. Honoria had taught me that any sign of emotion was a weakness she could exploit. My heart felt like it was being crushed by an iron glove, yet my face remained as smooth as marble. She had spent my entire life teaching me how to suppress every human instinct, turning me into a statue. "If you speak to that girl again," she whispered, her fingers digging into the fresh bruises she had left on my arm during our etiquette lesson, "I will not just dismiss her. I will ensure she is blacklisted from every kitchen in England. She will starve because of your love. Now, put on your mask and greet the Duchess." I realized then that my sister didn't want a brother, she wanted a weapon she could point at the world. The ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and heavy diamonds, but to me, it felt like a graveyard. I walked through the crowd, my back straight and my expression frozen in the icy control Honoria had beaten into me. Every time a noblewoman smiled at me, I saw only the shadow of my sister's hand. As soon as I could find a moment of darkness, I slipped away. I didn't go to the smoking room or the gardens. I headed for the stone stairs that led to the damp, flour-dusted world of the kitchens. I had to find Serafina. She was the one Honoria despised most, not just because of her low birth, but because she was the only person in Blackfriars who refused to bow her head when Honoria entered a room. I found her in the corner, her hair covered in white dust as she kneaded dough with a fierce, quiet intensity. The heat of the ovens was a relief compared to the coldness of the ballroom upstairs. She looked up, and for a second, her eyes weren't filled with the fear I saw in everyone else. She looked at me as if I were just a man, not an earl or a pawn. I stayed in the shadows, watching her work, realizing that she possessed a freedom I would never know as long as Honoria held my leash. I had to warn her, but the mere act of being here was a death sentence for her career. I felt the weight of my sister's threat like a noose tightening around my neck. I stepped closer into the light of a single tallow candle, and Serafina froze. She didn't drop her gaze, she watched me with a wary curiosity that made my heart ache. "You shouldn't be here, my lord," she whispered, her voice like soft velvet against the rough stone walls. I didn't answer right away. I reached out to adjust my cuff, and the sleeve of my fine coat pulled back just enough to reveal the dark, purple bruises Honoria had left on my forearm earlier. Serafina's eyes dropped to my skin, and she didn't gasp or look away in pity. Instead, she set down the dough and stepped toward me. Without a word, she pulled back her own sleeve, revealing a jagged, silver scar that ran from her wrist to her elbow, a souvenir from the workhouse where she had been raised. "The world bites us both, it seems," she said quietly. In that moment, the distance between an earl and a scullery maid vanished. We weren't a noble and a servant, we were two prisoners of the same cruel system, marked by those who thought they owned us. She didn't offer me pity, and I didn't offer her gold. We offered each other the truth of our scars. I realized then that while Honoria had taught me how to hide my pain, Serafina was teaching me how to acknowledge it. The emotional investment was instant and terrifying. I knew I would do anything to protect this girl, even if it meant destroying the only family I had left. The next morning, Honoria trapped me in the Cellar before I could even break my fast. She looked radiant in gold silk, but her smile was a jagged edge. "I have wonderful news, Alistair," she chirped, though her eyes remained as cold as a frozen lake. "I have finalized your engagement to the Baroness of Oakhaven. Her dowry will settle the estate's debts and secure our place at the king's right hand." My blood turned to ice. The Baroness was a woman known for her cruelty to servants and her absolute devotion to social standing. "I will not marry her," I said, my voice low and steady. Honoria's smile didn't falter. She reached into her desk and pulled out a yellowed piece of parchment. You will, dear brother. Or I will turn this over to the magistrate. It was a forged debt note, one that claimed Serafina's late father had stolen a fortune from our family. One word from me and your little scullery rat will spend the rest of her life in Newgate prison, she hissed. The high stakes were now a reality I couldn't escape. Honoria wasn't just threatening Serafina's job anymore, she was threatening her very life. I felt the familiar urge to lash out, but I remembered the control I had practiced for a decade. I bowed my head slightly, hiding the fire in my eyes. As you wish, sister, I replied. I needed time to find a way to burn that parchment before it burned us both. I waited until the house was silent and the moon was high before I made my way to the great library. I had sent a message through a trusted page to Serafina, asking her to meet me amongst the towering shelves of leather-bound books. When she appeared, she looked small against the vast knowledge of the room, but her spirit was undimmed. I told her about the forged debt and the Baroness. To my shock, Serafina didn't cry. She walked over to the desk and picked up a quill, her movements precise. I can read, Alistair, she said, her voice steady. And I can write. I've been reading the old family records when I clean the dust from these shelves. This was a secret that could get her whipped. Servants were forbidden from being literate in Blackfriars. She pointed to a shelf of hidden journals. The history your sister tells you is a lie. Your father didn't leave her in charge because he trusted her. He left a second will, one she thinks she destroyed. She began to explain the real history of our family, a history of a sister who had clawed her way to power by stepping on the necks of her brothers. She wasn't just a maid, she was the key to my inheritance. I felt a surge of hope. If we could find that second will, Honoria's power would vanish like smoke. The dinner to honor my engagement was a masterclass in psychological torture. Honoria sat at the head of the table, presiding over a dozen of the most powerful people in the county. The Baroness sat to my right, her laughter sounding like glass breaking. Every time I looked at her, I thought of Serafina scrubbing the floors below us. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. When the time came for the formal toast, I stood up, my glass filled with dark red wine. The room went silent, expectant. I looked at Honoria, who was watching me with a smug, triumphant grin. To the future of Blackfriars, I said, my voice echoing in the rafters. Then, instead of raising my glass to the Baroness, I set it down with a deliberate click. And to the truth that remains buried in the dark. I sat back down without another word. The silence that followed was deafening. The guests shifted uncomfortably, and for the first time, I saw Honoria's public mask slip. A vein throbbed in her forehead, and her hand shook as she reached for her own drink. I had delivered a blow to her pride in front of her peers, and I knew the retaliation would be swift. But I didn't care. I had begun the war. A few days later, Serafina found me in the stables, her face pale but her eyes burning with a discovery. I found it, Alistair. In the coal cellar, hidden behind a loose stone. She pulled a small, grimy ledger from her apron. It wasn't the second will, but it was something just as dangerous. It was a record of the local water supply. I scanned the pages and felt a cold fury settle in my bones. Honoria had been systematically poisoning the wells of the tenant farmers for 3 years. She used a chemical that made the cattle sick but didn't kill them immediately, forcing the farmers into such debt that they had no choice but to sell their ancestral lands to her for pennies. She was building an empire on the suffering of those we were meant to protect. I looked at Serafina, realizing she had risked everything to bring me this. This ledger was the proof of Honoria's criminal madness. We now had a weapon, but we had to be careful how we used it. If Honoria knew we had this, she wouldn't just threaten us, she would silence us permanently. The stakes had escalated from a family dispute to a battle for the lives of every person on our land. Honoria found me in the kitchens that evening. I expected her to scream, to strike me, or to drag me away. Instead, she was eerily calm, her voice a soft purr that was far more terrifying than any shout. She sat on a wooden stool, her fine silk dress looking out of place among the copper pots. I've decided to be generous, Alistair, she said, her eyes fixed on Serafina, who was standing by the hearth. "Since you are so fond of the staff, I have decided that Serafina shall be the lead server for your engagement gala next week. She will be the one to present the rings to you and the Baroness." My heart hammered against my ribs. It was a trap. Honoria wanted to force Serafina to witness my union with another woman, to humiliate her in front of the entire nobility. She was testing my control, seeing if I would break to save the girl. Serafina looked at me, and I saw the silent plea in her eyes, not for me to save her, but for me to stay strong. "That would be most appropriate, sister," I said, my voice as cold as stone. Honoria smiled, a predator who thought she had cornered her prey. I walked out of the kitchen, my mind already racing. I would let her set the stage, but I would be the one to rewrite the ending. The day of the gala arrived, and the house was a hive of activity. Honoria had personally selected Serafina's attire for the evening. It wasn't a servant's uniform, it was a mockery of a gown, tattered, yellowed lace that looked like it had been pulled from a trash heap. It was designed to make Serafina look like a beggar among kings, a visual representation of the contempt Honoria held for her. When I saw Serafina in the dressing room, her eyes were filled with tears of shame, but she held her chin high. I walked over to her, ignoring the guards Honoria had stationed at the door. I didn't offer her comfort or tell her it didn't matter. Instead, I used my sister's lessons in calculated moves. I took a small, sharp knife from my pocket and began to trim the ragged edges of the lace. I pinned a single, real sapphire brooch, one that had belonged to my mother, at her throat. "They will look at you, Serafina," I whispered. "But they will not see a beggar. They will see the woman I have chosen." My control was absolute now. I wasn't acting out of anger, I was acting with the precision of a surgeon. The gala was about to begin, and the fuse was lit. The grand ballroom was dazzling, the air thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sound of a string quartet. Honoria stood at the top of the stairs, the Baroness at her side, both looking like queens of a dark court. The moment came for the engagement to be finalized. The music stopped, and the king's representative stepped forward. "Bring forth the rings," Honoria commanded, her voice ringing with triumph. Serafina began her long walk across the marble floor, the tattered lace of her dress fluttering. The nobility began to titter and whisper, pointing at the scullery rat in her ruined clothes. Honoria's face was a mask of pure delight. But as Serafina reached the center of the room, I didn't wait for her to come to me. I stepped off the dais and met her halfway. I ignored the Baroness and the king's man. I took Serafina's hand and kissed it in front of every guest. "I thank you, Serafina, for your service to the estate's bookkeeping and your tireless work for the tenants," I said loudly. "You are the guest of honor this evening." The room went deathly silent. Honoria's jaw dropped, her triumph turning into a scream of silent rage. I had flipped the script, turning her humiliation into a public recognition of Serafina's worth. In the chaos that followed my public display, the Baroness pulled me into a side alcove. I expected her to slap me or demand an end to the engagement. Instead, she looked over her shoulder, her face pale with fear. "You are a fool, Alistair, but a brave one," she whispered. "You think you are the only one Honoria controls? She has my father's gambling debts and my mother's private letters. She is blackmailing my entire family to force this marriage. She doesn't want me for your wife, she wants my family's vote in the House of Lords." This was the twist I hadn't seen coming. Honoria wasn't just a cruel sister, she was a political spider weaving a web far larger than Blackfriars. The Baroness gripped my arm. "If you find a way to stop her, my family will stand with you. But you must hurry. She is planning to have you sent away after the papers are signed tonight. We had a secret alliance now. I wasn't alone in this fight." I told her to wait and be ready. I had to find Serafina and the ledger before Honoria realized the full extent of our plan. I found Serafina in the servants' hall, but she was in trouble. Honoria had ordered the footman to seize her, accusing her of stealing the sapphire brooch I had given her. They were dragging her toward the fire in the great hall, where Honoria was already tossing letters and documents into the flames. "You think you can challenge me with a scullery maid?" Honoria shrieked as I entered. I will burn everything before I let you take this estate. She threw a bundle of papers into the hearth. Serafina broke free from the guards and dove toward the fire, reaching into the embers with her bare hands. She pulled out a half-charred map and a heavy envelope before the guards tackled her again. I have it, she screamed through the pain of her burns. I rushed forward, pushing the guards aside. The map showed the secret borders of the estate, and the envelope contained the second will. It proved that my father had left everything to me and my older brother, Julian, with Honoria only as a temporary guardian until our majority. The will she had shown me for years was a total forgery. Honoria didn't wait for a legal challenge. She signaled her private guards, men she had hired from the city who owed no loyalty to the Blackfriars name. My brother has finally lost his mind, she told the gathered guests who had wandered toward the noise. The stress of the engagement has broken him. He is hallucinating about forged wills and talking to servants as if they were equals. Before I could speak, they threw a heavy cloak over my head and dragged me toward the east wing, the part of the manor that had been a prison for the mad members of our family for centuries. I heard the heavy iron bolts slide into place. Through the small barred window, I saw the guards throwing Serafina out into the driving rain of a southern spring storm. Find her! I shouted, beating my fists against the door, but my voice was swallowed by the thunder. I was an earl in a gilded cage, and the only person who could save me was a girl lost in the dark and the rain. Days passed in the freezing silence of the east wing. I watched the world through the narrow bars, my heart heavy with fear for Serafina. But then, on the third morning, I saw something moving in the distance. Below the window, near the laundry lines, a series of colored cloths were being hung in a strange pattern. I realized it was Serafina. She was using the laundry signals she had used in the kitchens to communicate. A red cloth meant danger, a white one meant she was safe, and a blue one meant she had found an ally. She was hanging a blue cloth followed by a yellow one, the color of the tenant farmers. She was rallying the people Honoria had poisoned. They were coming for the manor. I used a piece of charcoal from the fireplace to scrawl a message on a scrap of cloth and dropped it from the window when the guard wasn't looking. We were plotting a revolution from two sides of a stone wall, and the control Honoria had taught me was the only thing keeping me from screaming in frustration. The door to my cell opened, and I expected Honoria. Instead, it was the family physician, a man who had known me since I was a babe. He looked nervous, his hands shaking as he prepared a tincture. The Lady Honoria says you need rest, Alistair, he murmured, refusing to meet my eyes. I looked at the dark liquid in the glass and remembered the ledger Serafina had found. I realized Honoria wasn't just waiting for me to go mad, she was making sure I never woke up. I grabbed the doctor's wrist, and he jumped. How much is she paying you to kill the Earl? I asked, my voice a low, terrifying growl. He broke down, sobbing that she had threatened his children. He revealed that the medicine was laced with arsenic. I didn't strike him. I used his fear. If you want to live, you will tell her I have taken the dose. Then you will leave the back door to the east wing unlocked tonight. He nodded frantically, a man caught between two monsters. The night was thick with fog as I slipped out of the east wing. Just as I reached the courtyard, I heard a massive roar from the front gates. Serafina had arrived. She wasn't alone, he was leading a group of 50 farmers armed with pitchforks and torches. They were shouting for justice, demanding to see the Earl. It was the perfect distraction. As Honoria's guards rushed to the front to hold the gates, Serafina slipped through a side hedge and met me in the shadows. She looked exhausted, her clothes soaked and her hands bandaged from the fire, but her eyes were bright with victory. We don't have much time, she whispered, handing me a small set of metal tools. I stole these from the clockmaker. You told me once how the locks in this house worked. I used the etiquette-concealed lockpicks she had smuggled to open the cellar doors. We weren't running away, we were going deeper into the heart of the manor to find the final truth. We descended into the old Roman tunnels that ran beneath the foundation of Blackfriars. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and ancient secrets. As we reached the deepest chamber, Serafina's lantern caught the glint of something white. We stepped closer and froze. It was a skeleton, dressed in the rotted remnants of a fine silk coat. I recognized the gold buttons. They were the ones my older brother, Julian, had worn the day he ran away 10 years ago. Honoria had told me he had abandoned his duties because he was weak, leaving her to mold me into the man he couldn't be. But he hadn't run away. He had been murdered and hidden here so that Honoria could maintain her control over the estate. The true Earl had never left. He had been waiting for us to find him. I knelt beside my brother's remains, my heart shattering into a million pieces. Among the bones, I found a heavy gold ring, the signet of the firstborn Earl of Blackfriars. Honoria had a replica, but this was the original, passed down through 5 generations. It was the ultimate proof of her crime. She hadn't just forged a will, she had cleared her path with blood. I stood up, the ring gripped tightly in my fist. The man I had become, the cold, controlled statue, died in that tunnel. I was no longer an earl or a pawn. I was a brother seeking justice. I looked at Serafina, and she took my hand, her strength grounding me. "We have everything we need," she said. "It's time to face her." We began the long climb back to the surface, ready to end the reign of the woman who had turned our lives into a nightmare. We emerged from the tunnels into the great hall just as Honoria was ordering her guards to fire on the farmers at the gate. She turned, her face pale with shock as she saw us standing there, covered in the dust of the dead. I held up the signet ring, and she stumbled back, her hand going to her throat. "Julian says hello, Honoria," I said, my voice sounding like a bell in the silent room. She pulled a small pistol from her silk skirts and pointed it at Serafina. "You should have stayed in the flower dust, girl," she shrieked. But I didn't flinch. I walked toward her, using the psychological control she had taught me. I spoke to her softly, calmly, pointing out every lie she had ever told me, dismantling her reality piece by piece until the gun began to shake in her hand. "You aren't a queen, Honoria. You're just a scared girl who thinks power can hide her crimes." The confrontation was interrupted by a loud pounding on the front doors. A man in a black cloak entered, flanked by several lawyers. It was the shadowy debt collector from London who had been buying up the estate's debts. Honoria laughed, a high, desperate sound. "You're too late, Alistair. The house is being seized. Neither of us will have it." She turned to the collector. "Take the boy and the girl. They are trespassers." But the man didn't look at her. He looked at Serafina, his eyes filling with tears. He took off his hat and bowed low. "I have been searching for you for 15 years, Serafina," he said. This was the merchant tycoon I had heard of, a man who had built a fortune in the East. He wasn't there to take the house. He was Serafina's long-lost uncle, and he had spent his life becoming powerful enough to find the niece who had been stolen from his family. The power dynamic in the room shifted so fast it made Honoria dizzy. The scullery rat was suddenly the niece of the wealthiest man in the city. The debt collector, Serafina's uncle, handed the deeds of Blackfriars to her. "The estate is yours, niece. Do with it what you will." Honoria fell to her knees, her silk dress spreading out like a dying flower. She had gambled everything on the idea that she was the only one who could be powerful. Now, she was at the mercy of the woman she had spent her life despising. Serafina looked at the deeds, then at me. She didn't gloat, and she didn't scream. She walked over to Honoria and held out a hand. "I offer you the release of your debts, Honoria. All you have to do is sign the confession regarding Julian and the farmers." Honoria looked at the papers, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. Even in defeat, she tried to find a way to win. "I will never sign," she hissed. "I would rather see us all burn." She tried to lunge for the papers, but Serafina's uncle stepped in the way. He revealed that he had already spoken to the king's magistrates. The evidence was overwhelming. Honoria was cornered, but she had one last card to play. She knew the social laws of the time better than anyone. "Alistair is still my brother," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "I am his legal guardian. I will have him committed to the asylum before I sign a single word. No one will believe the word of a lost heiress and a mad earl." She was trying to use the law as a final cage, a way to keep us bound to her even as her world crumbled. I realized I had to take the fight to a place where Honoria couldn't hide behind her silk skirts. I demanded a public trial in the village court, the very place where she had cheated the farmers. We didn't hire a lawyer. I stood in the center of the room, and one by one, the people of the land stood up and told their stories. They talked about the sick cattle, the poisoned wells, and the threats. The high stakes of social ruin were now squarely on Honoria. She sat in the dock, her head held high, trying to look like a victim of a peasant uprising. But when Serafina stood up and produced the ledger and the map, the room went silent. The truth was a physical weight that Honoria couldn't carry. The judge, a man who had once been Honoria's ally, couldn't ignore the proof. Before the verdict could be read, Honoria managed to escape the court through a side door, aided by a few guards she still had on her payroll. In her madness, she kidnapped Serafina from the carriage outside and raced toward the Blackfriars cliffs, the highest point on the estate. I followed her on horseback, my heart in my throat. I reached the edge of the cliff just as the sun was setting. Honoria was holding Serafina at the very edge, the wind whipping their hair. "You can have the girl or the title, Alistair," she screamed over the sound of the crashing waves. "Choose now. One lives, and the other dies." She was trying to force me back into the control she had taught me, to make me make a logical choice that would destroy my soul. I didn't hesitate. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the Blackfriars signet ring, the true one I had found in the tunnels. I held it up for her to see, then I threw it with all my might into the churning sea below. "I never wanted the crown, Honoria," I shouted. "I only wanted the man you tried to kill. The title is gone. There is nothing left to fight for." Honoria watched the gold disappear into the water, and for a second, she looked completely broken. The thing she had killed for, lied for, and lived for was gone. She loosened her grip on Serafina, and I lunged forward, pulling Serafina into my arms and dragging her away from the edge. We were safe, but the war wasn't over. As I pulled Serafina to safety, Honoria's grief turned into a final, murderous rage. She lunged at me with a small dagger she had hidden in her sleeve. But as she struck, her foot caught on a loose stone at the cliff's edge. She began to fall backward into the abyss. I reached out, my hand closing around her wrist at the last possible second. I held her there, suspended over the crashing waves. I had total control over her life. I could have let go, and no one would have blamed me. But I looked into her eyes and saw only a lonely, broken woman. I pulled her back with a burst of strength, dragging her onto the solid ground. I refused to let her become a martyr, and I refused to become a murderer. I had finally used her lessons in control to save her from herself. The king's investigators arrived the next morning, led by the Baroness and her family. They had found the remains in the tunnels and the arsenic in the doctor's office. The evidence was undeniable. Honoria was arrested, but because of her high birth and her mental state, she was spared the gallows. She was stripped of all her rights and her name. The Baroness looked at me with a sad smile. "You did it, Alistair. You broke the web." The tax fraud was proven, and the lands were ordered to be returned to the farmers. The estate was in ruins, but for the first time in a century, the air in Blackfriars felt clean. We had survived the storm, and the truth had finally set us free. Honoria was taken to the very asylum she had designed for me, a cold, stone building where she would spend the rest of her days. She was left with nothing but a single silver mirror. I visited her one last time before she was taken away. She sat in the corner, staring at her reflection, her beauty faded by madness and defeat. She didn't recognize me at first. When she finally looked up, she asked in a small, hollow voice, "Did you finally learn how to love, Alistair?" I looked at the door, where Serafina was waiting for me in the sunlight. "I learned love from the woman you despised," I told her, "and I learned mercy from the brother you murdered." I walked away, leaving the shadow of my sister behind forever. Alistair and Serafina were married a month later in the middle of the village square. There were no dukes or duchesses in attendance, just the farmers and the servants who had stood with us. I formally renounced the Blackfriars title, declaring that the age of lords and slaves was over on our land. We rebranded the estate as Sarah's Reach. We turned the manor into a school for the children of the poor and a place of fair trade for the farmers. We lived in the small cottage near the stables, the place where we had first shared our secrets. I was no longer an earl, but I was a man who was loved, and that was a title worth more than any crown. Years passed, and the story of the Earl and the scullery maid became a legend in the county. We had children who grew up knowing that their worth was found in their hearts, not their bloodlines. One evening, as the sun set over the hills of Sarah's Reach, I sat in the garden with Seraphina. I thought about the mirror Honoria had smashed all those years ago. It had taken 1,000 shards to show me the truth. I looked at my hands. They were rough now, from working the land alongside my neighbors. "Are you happy, Alistair?" Seraphina asked, leaning her head on my shoulder. I watched the children playing in the distance and felt a peace I had never known. "I am free," I whispered. "And that is the greatest love of all."